given back. His people blew up the UN ambassador to Iraq because he, the great international civil servant, Sergio de Mello, had overseen the independence of East Timor in its transition. They murdered him for that as an infidel. Look what they did to Afghanistan.
Hitch, you're right about also. I don't want to.
We're looking we're looking fascism in the face with this guy, and yes, I think his defeat should be obliterating, total, final, and humiliating too. And I'd like a bit of applause for that, please, just for the audience on the TV. Thanks. Not enough applause. Sorry. This is Washington.
It's very, very interesting. What Hitch has done is said he thinks that it was a good thing that the defeat of Germany was an annihilating defeat. I agree with that. I think that the defeat needed to be complete and definitive. We've seen in recent history that if you don't finish the job, then it just comes back to haunt you and it makes things worse later. So he's right about that. We're not actually disagreeing on ends here, but we're talking about means. And in fact, in the doctrine of just war, all the way back to Aquinas and Hugo Grotius and all the other people who in our tradition have written about these things, there is this concept of proportionality. If the aim is to defeat the enemy, then let's try and do it if you're going to be as civilized and reflective about it as you can be, even though war is a dirty business. And we've granted from remarks I made earlier on that there have to be limits even in war. Then you've got to try and do it in a way which is consistent with that idea of proportion. And what I mean by it is this. If you have a toothache, you can cure it by chopping off your head, but that's a bit extreme. You try and cure it by a means that leaves the rest of you intact if you can. And so some considered way of doing these things is obviously the preferred option. On the point about I'm drawing an analogy here between the idea of an annihilating defeat and using any means available to you to get that defeat in order to make sure that the monster isn't going to rise up again. And on that, we're absolutely agreed. But what I want to try to do is to discriminate, in the literal sense of that term, is to look at a central fact about something. Now, ask ourselves the question, you've set yourself a certain aim. Is it a legitimate means to that end to pick a civilian population, to attack it, to kill as many of them as you can, to frighten everybody else by that terrifying attack on them? Is that ever justified? Now, there might be circumstances, there might be very, very extreme circumstances where the great and sometimes worthwhile fig leaf of the idea of collateral damage comes into play here. The idea that there are very, very regrettable, sincerely regrettable, but unavoidable casualties of non-combatants, of innocents, of people who aren't engaged when a legitimate target is attacked. But I think one has to be very careful about that. One has to say that has got to be the rare occasion. You've got to make a jolly good case for claiming that it was unavoidable that those people were hurt. And if you're doing something very different from that, if you're actually targeting civilians in order to kill and terrorize, that in itself, the intrinsic quality of that act, no matter whether you think you've got a declared war, no matter whether it's states that are the actors in the case, no matter whether it's a terrorist organization, has to be wrong. If you think 9/11 was wrong, and it was an atrocity, then you've got to think that systematically and deliberately attempting to massacre civilians in any circumstance is an atrocity. So I'm going to stick with that point. Now I must pick up Hitch on the oh, thank you, there you are. So the point about mutiny, okay? I think with great respect, Hitch misreads me there. I didn't think that the RAF should mutiny. I quote in the book the phrase in the Wehrmacht paybook, which said that if you think you've been given an illegal order, you can disobey it. And that it actually happened that Wehrmacht soldiers, I don't think very many SS soldiers did, but some exempted themselves from actions that they didn't agree with and survived. Now, in the case of the Royal Air Force personnel, the USAAF personnel, I say there, in an ideal world, I say, preface that, don't I? I say, in an ideal situation, if these airmen were asked, will you go in for area bombing civilian populations, or will you go for tactical targets, important military industrial targets, that they should have opted for the latter? I didn't say they should mutiny, certainly not. And I grant also a number of things. I grant that they really believed, with great justification, that they were engaged in a just war, that they had the support of the majority of their populations. These were young men putting their lives on the line. It moves me to think that 55,000 very, very young men died in the sky over Germany in the Royal Air Force from Britain and the British Empire. 45,000 United States Army Air Force personnel died in the air, a terrifying and awful death. And I have to comment because it is one of the awful ironies of war. It's the sort of thing that Hitch would appreciate, maybe. That those 55,000 Royal Air Force personnel died in the process of killing 350,000 Germans, German children and women and elderly people and people who were not directly engaged in active combat. A ratio of 7 to 1. What general would send his troops into battle if he thought those were the odds?
Okay. I think I've got to. I mean, unless, okay, you can vote me down, ladies and gentlemen, if you like, but you haven't voted me down. Well, it isn't preface, actually. I'm not quibbling, but you phrase the question like this, under hard questions. Should airmen have refused to carry out area bombing raids? Yes. Then, as you say, your reasoning follows, but it's not, you don't preface it with that. Yes means yes, it seems to me. And I think I would not have said it. I mean, Commander Hitchens, of blessed memory, I can promise you, did not join the Royal Navy and sail all around the world for His Majesty the King in order to end up running guns to Stalin, which he ended up doing over the hump of Murmansk and Archangel, when the Scandinavian coast was entirely controlled by the Luftwaffe, and the seas largely controlled by the U-boats. Very unpleasant job. He thought it was outrageous to be helping the Stalin regime to go. But he did not, I think, well, this is so much against my conscience I can't do it. How could I have impeached him if he had? Well, these might be questions for another day. I think I'm glad, on the whole, that people decided that the British government was a decent enough one to have its orders obeyed, even if questionable things were being done. And I could instance a whole number of other episodes in the Second World War, possibly the sinking of the French fleet at anchor when it was not in aggressive mode, that the British did, that were also to be questioned and would make an excellent moral exercise.
Mm-hmm. Let me stop you just for a second, because I want to make sure that there is time for questions.
I simply have to say this. It's extending my Klemperer point. Precision bombing would have done an awful lot of damage to the German war effort in Dresden. There's no question about it. And probably more, arguably more than area bombing did. But the next day, precision bombing would have left the same people in charge of Dresden, I'm sorry to say, and Victor Klemperer would have got on that fucking cattle truck. The same, because the order wouldn't have been destroyed. There wouldn't have been total chaos, the utter destruction of the state system and its... Now, anyone who's seen the pictures of those, even in German camps on German soil, relatively lenient, at Buchenwald and Dachau, the condition of the people who were, as they were found by British and American soldiers, can see that those people have only got a few more days to live at best. They're all dying, in effect. Another few months of this war, and they would all have died, as so many of them did in Poland and Hungary and elsewhere. This also has to be borne in mind in considering the Japanese Empire and its hideous god king. Every day that country didn't surrender. I personally opposed to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I can tell you something that Dr. Edward Teller once told me, that it was his view that there should have been a demonstration bomb dropped and not a use of it on civilian cities. But, urgent question to let off a bomb, because every day the Japanese Empire goes on, thousands of its slaves are dying, and we have the right and the duty to save them, it seems to me. So, I am sorry if that's too much, but I thought I couldn't not say that. This is urgent. And it's a terrible utilitarian calculus. Shall you kill more Germans to rescue their slaves and their victims? Well, you could, I suppose, you can compose it by saying, if I prayed, this is what I would say. I don't, but I would say, well, thank God we didn't start this.
Could I trespass on everybody's patience? Because there's a point, not to disagree with Hitch this time, but just a point cognate to what he's just said there, which is that on the 28th of March 1945, Churchill sent a memo to a man called Sir Charles Portal, who was the head of the RAF, to say to him, the terror bombing of the German cities, that's his phrase, the terror bombing, must now stop. He said, the bombing of Dresden is a serious query against RAF behavior. It's very, very interesting that he wrote this memo, because at certain points during the war, he came out with tremendous speeches about, flattening the German cities, and on other occasions, he had horrible fits of conscience about it. There was one occasion when he leapt to his feet watching footage of bombing of the Ruhr Valley, which was a heavily industrialized area of Germany, and said, are we animals? What are we doing? Why are we doing this? This was right in the middle of the war. And that memo that he sent the 28th of March was returned to him by Sir Charles Portal with a note saying, you can't write to me like this. You're